Good afternoon to those of you who are on the East Coast, and good morning still to those of you who are in other time zones. My name is Chuck Williams. I'm going to be your presenter today. We're going to discuss advocacy work, and our focus is going to be on mass incarceration and the role of the church. So the first thing that I want to say to you is that I am not an expert in this area. I am just a person who took this up with an interest, with a passion because of what has been happening. So just as I'm able to do that, I want to share with you how you can do the same thing. So what I'm going to do is, because I found myself putting this together, I had more slides than I knew what to do with. I had more information than I knew what to do with. I had to delete or hide a lot of slides in order to shrink it into the 45-minute time zone. If you have questions, I do welcome them. I would ask if you can hold them off till the end so that we can get through the presentation, and then I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Let's see. The other thing that I do want to do is I do want to thank LaKesha and Quinta for this opportunity. We had an awesome keynote speaker this morning. I was surprised at a number of things that he had to say that fit right into some of the slides that I have. So this should be a good experience for you. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take myself off view so that you can focus on the screen. I hope you don't mind that, but I'll come back into view once the session is over. So let us begin. I want to make a declaration. The criminal justice system is not broken. And that was the conclusion that I came after I joined my church, Scotland A&E Zion Church in Potomac, Maryland. For those who may be unfamiliar with it, Scotland is a small neighborhood of lower middle class African Americans. And they have this little enclave inside of the town of Potomac, which is one of the most affluent communities in the United States. Now, the young African American men in the community were being characterized as gang members. I did outreach work when I joined the church, and I started working with them. And I foresaw that this was going to be problematic. And as I advocated on their behalf, the proverbial light bulb came on as I realized what was happening. And I want to share that with you today. So today's objective is to show you how you can create your advocacy plan. But before we get started in that, I have a couple of questions that I want to answer as to how and why does the church have a role in this process. Then I want to get everybody on the same page. What I find helpful is that if I share definitions to certain words, we all know that we're thinking the same way. I want to show you something so you can understand the end-to-end process as far as mass incarceration, the impact on the African American community, and then we want to get into creating the advocacy plan. And then we want to review some effective advocacy techniques. So the first thing is, what does the church have to say? So first I'm going to ask, well, what does the Bible have to say? Please give me feedback if the audio cannot be heard. I'm lowering mine because I heard other people with echoes yesterday.
If you were a praying mantis, it would be socially acceptable to devour your mates. And if you're a honey badger, you have no regard for other animals. You don't care. If you're a panda with twins, it's normal to abandon one to take care of the other. But if humans do any of these things, we would call it wrong, unfair, or unjust. Yeah, why is that? Why do humans care so much about justice? Well, the Bible has a fascinating response to that question. On page 1, humans are set apart from all other creatures as the image of God. Yeah, God's representatives who rule the world by his definition of good and evil. And this identity is the bedrock of the Bible's view of justice. All humans are equal before God and have the right to be treated with dignity and fairness no matter who you are. And that would be nice if we all did that. But we know how the world really works. And the Bible addresses that too. It shows how we are constantly redefining good and evil to our own advantage at the expense of others.
Yeah, self-preservation. And the weaker someone is, the easier it is to take advantage of them.
And so in the biblical story, we see this happening on a personal level, but also in families, and then in communities, and in whole civilizations that create injustice, especially towards the vulnerable. But the story doesn't end there. Out of this whole mess, God chose a man named Abraham to start a new kind of family. Specifically, Abraham was to teach his family to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice.
If doing righteousness, that's a Bible word I don't really use, but what comes to mind is being a good person.
But what does that even mean, being good? The biblical Hebrew word for righteousness is tzedakah, and it's more specific. It's an ethical standard that refers to right relationships between people. It's about treating others as the image of God,
with the God-given dignity they deserve.
And this word justice, it's the Hebrew word mishpat. It can refer to retributive justice.
Like if I steal something, I pay the consequences.
Exactly. Yet most often in the Bible, mishpat refers to restorative justice. It means going a step further, actually seeking out vulnerable people who are being taken advantage of and helping them.
Yeah, some people call this charity.
But mishpat involves way more. It means taking steps to advocate for the vulnerable and changing social structures to prevent injustice.
So justice and righteousness are about a radical, selfless way of life.
Yeah, and you find this idea all over the Bible. Like here, in the book of Proverbs, what does it mean to bring about just righteousness?
Open your mouth for those who can't speak for themselves.
And what do these words mean for the prophets, like Jeremiah?
Rescue the disadvantaged, and don't tolerate oppression or violence against the immigrant, the orphan, and the widow.
And like here, look in the book of Psalms.
The Lord God upholds justice for the oppressed, gives food to the hungry, and sets the prisoner free. But he thwarts the way of the wicked. Whoa, he thwarts the wicked?
Yeah, in Hebrew, the word wicked is rasha. It means guilty or in the wrong. It refers to someone who mistreats another human, ignoring their dignity as an image of God.
So justice and righteousness is a big deal to God.
Yes, it's what Abraham's family, the Israelites, were to be all about. They ended up as immigrant slaves, being oppressed unjustly in Egypt. And so God confronted Egypt's evil, declaring them to be rasha, guilty of injustice. And so he rescued Israel. But the tragic irony of the Old Testament story is that these redeemed people went on to commit the same acts of injustice against the vulnerable. And so God sent prophets who declared Israel guilty.
But they weren't the only ones. There's injustice everywhere.
Yeah, some people actively perpetrate injustice. Others receive benefits or privileges from unjust social structures they take for granted. And sadly, history has shown that when the oppressed gain power, they often become oppressors themselves.
So we all participate in injustice, actively or passively, even unintentionally. We're all the guilty ones.
And so this is the surprising message of the biblical story. God's response to humanity's legacy of injustice is to give us a gift, the life of Jesus. He did righteousness and justice, and yet he died on behalf of the guilty. But then God declared Jesus to be the righteous one when he rose from the dead. And so now Jesus offers his life to the guilty so that they too can be declared righteous before God, not because of anything they've done, but because of what Jesus did for them.
The earliest followers of Jesus experienced this righteousness from God, not just as a new status, but as a power that changed their lives and compelled them to act in surprising new ways.
Yeah, if God declared someone righteous when they didn't deserve it, the only reasonable response is to go and seek righteousness and justice for others.
This is a radical way of life, and it's not always convenient or easy. It's courageously making other people's problems my problems.
This is what Jesus meant by loving your neighbor as yourself. It's about a lifetime commitment fueled by the words of the ancient prophet Micah. God has told you, humans, what is good, and what the Lord requires of you is to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God.
So I find that I could be long-winded, so sometimes I've inserted these because they can get to the point much faster than I can. So now that we know that there's a biblical foundation for advocating on behalf of those who fall victim to this injustice, how has the church addressed this in the past? And if we look at these bullet points, it was the Quakers back in 1688 that first started as a religious group that started to oppose slavery. And the Second Great Awakening was the birthplace of the anti-slavery movement. That's where a lot of abolitionists came out of. During the days of slavery, both the black and white churches were stationed on Harriet Tubman's Underground Railroad. It was the church that turned the tide of the Civil War. Lincoln started out as a preservation of the Union, but shifted to a war of liberation against enslavement. The black churches expanded throughout the South. They provided some of the early support systems. The black churches also encouraged the community of better days to come during the Jim Crow era. And the black church led the civil rights and voting rights efforts during the 1960s. So moving on to there, I just want to give you a quick review of definitions, as I mentioned. What is the definition of advocacy? And when I pulled it up in the Webster Dictionary, it said advocacy is the process of informing and influencing people in order to bring about change. My definition is something far more active, and it's broken into two parts. I'm going to read the last part. Advocacy is addressing the underlying causes of a problem, providing the solutions, and creating change to eliminate the problem. The first part, service, is providing relief or support to people affected by the problem. And I usually advocate for that to be in the front and the back of your issue. In the front so that you understand what they're going through, and the back so that you can inspect what you expect so that you know that you have done something to address the problem. I also want to look at the definition of mass incarceration. Now, surprisingly, the Webster Dictionary does not have a definition. So I had to seek elsewhere. And I went to the AFL-CIO website. They have a definition that fits what we're talking about. Mass incarceration is a rate of imprisonment that is marked above the historical and comparative norms for societies of this type. It is when imprisonments cease to be the incarceration of individual offenders and becomes the systematic imprisonment of whole groups of the population. Keep that in mind as we move forward here. Lastly, for definitions, I want to share the definition of racism as found in Webster's Dictionary. They broke it into three parts. The first is a belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. That didn't sound like racism to me. That sounded more like white supremacy. The second definition, a doctrine or political program based on the assumption of racism and designed to execute its principles, or a political or social system founded on racism. Well, what I learned a long time ago is you can't use the same word to define its own definition. So I'm going to strike that one out also. The third one, racial prejudice or discrimination. That doesn't tell me a lot. Kind of nebulous, wishy-washy. Here is my definition as I learned it. Racism is an act or a systematic plan designed and utilized by a person or people in power, keyword, to oppress or deny a person or group of people of another race based upon the racial discriminations, prejudices, and prejudgments of the holders of power. Keep power in mind. So again, I want to go to something that will give you a faster explanation of the end-to-end process than I can talk about here.
Good morning, John. It's Friday. A few weeks ago, a company called Visually emailed me and was like, hey, Hank, if you could do a high-quality animated video on any issue in the world, what would you choose? Now, that was a hard choice, but I went with incarceration in America because it is messed up. Now, crime is also messed up. Bad things happen to good people, and that's terrible, and something should be done about it. But we send people to prison to be punished, and to prevent them from doing bad things again, and to deter others from breaking the law. Punishment, corrections, and deterrence. Now, we have this habit of thinking of prisoners as something very external to society. After all, there are literal walls between them and society, walls capped with razor wire and watched over by people with guns. But millions of prisoners are released each year. Today's prisoners are tomorrow's neighbors, so corrections should probably be the most important piece of the incarceration pie. Unfortunately, it is not. We are, however, really good at punishment. America has about 4% of the world's people and about 25% of the world's incarcerated people. We have the highest incarceration rate in the world. Over the last 30 years, that number has skyrocketed, increasing over 400%. 41% of American juveniles and young adults have been arrested by the time they turn 23. Children as young as 13 years old have been sentenced to die in prison. And our prisons violate international standards. Solitary confinement increases instability and violence in inmates and is considered by international law to be torture. But in America, it's not regulated by anyone except the prison officials. No judge, no jury. Arguably the most devastating form of punishment we enact in this country, and yet there is no appeals process. And you think it's hard to get a job in America? Well, we make it intentionally more difficult to get a job once you have a conviction on your record, not to mention just to live your life. Convicts are ineligible for welfare, student loans, public housing, food stamps, and are often socially disconnected from community and family support structures. So in addition to having high recidivism rates, they have very high rates of homelessness and suicide. Somewhere along the way, we started to think that being tough on crime meant being tough on criminals, but that's not the same thing. Punishment is only one piece of a much larger crime reduction pie. And it's an expensive one, with some institutions paying more than $100,000 per year per prisoner. Long prison sentences have helped to decrease crime, but no more than 25% of the decrease we've seen can be attributed to incarceration, and it costs far beyond just dollars. The cost is to people, to our country, to communities, to families, and to ourselves. The policy seems to be, if you committed a felony, we just give up on you. These wars on crime, wars on drugs, they are wars on people. The smart political move is to appear tough on crime because crime is scary. So we increased minimum sentences, we arrested more people, we sent more of them to prison. That's how we looked tough on crime. But the results are in. It's bad policy. It's cruel, it's short-sighted, and to continue this policy of mass incarceration would be foolish. We're living inside of a massive $75 billion per year failed experiment. 2010 was the first year in nearly 40 years that the number of incarcerated individuals in America did not increase. Policymakers are beginning to realize the magnitude of this failure, but there is a long way to go. John, I'll see you on Tuesday.
So the question is, how did we get here? And let me just say, for the benefit of, I see in the chat, and I'm getting text messages. Yeah, I intentionally took myself off view so that we can focus on the screen. I hope you don't mind. But how did we get here? So let's take a look at some history. Africans were brought here in 1619 as enslaved indentured servants, and by 1662, chattel slavery became a permanent situation, and that was determined by the freedom or the slavery status of the mother. The emancipation was supposed to free slaves, but it only gave freedom to the enslaved people in the 10 states that were no longer part of the Union, not to the slave states that stayed with the Union. However, eventually, Lincoln and the radical Republicans did pass the 13th Amendment, but we discovered when they did that there was a loophole. The 13th Amendment reads, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. In other words, you must be deemed a criminal to be subjected to the conditions we experienced in chattel slavery. And yes, Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Well, the end of Reconstruction resulted in an American Holocaust of the, I'm a little beyond ahead of myself, forgive me. With the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments granting us citizenship and the right to vote for men only, we were able to elect black officers, black office holders, and to govern with the protection of Union soldiers during the Reconstruction period. But we ran into a buzzsaw and a brick wall. The end of Reconstruction resulted in an American Holocaust of a magnitude that was far worse than slavery. This lasted for a period of 87 years, far longer than Hitler's oppression of the Jewish people in Germany and the treatment that was far more inhumane. And after suffering through this Jim Crow people, we as a people were able to persevere with the movement calling for civil rights. That movement, having sacrificed by spilling blood and losing lives, was led by Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. There was a mistake in their format strategy, and we'll get into that later. Eventually, they were successful in securing the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Bill and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And while this took some weight off of our backs, we did not see the next oppressive move coming, and that was to criminalize African Americans in order to continue keeping us oppressed and under the authorities' control. In the post-civil rights era, African Americans went through a period of being linked to criminalization. Several of the Republican presidents used what was termed dog whistle politics, calling for control and criminalizing African Americans, but they were not the only ones. As Bill Clinton felt it necessary to show white voters that he could be tough on blacks, he called out Sister Soldier for comments she made during the Rodney King verdict uprising and denied student loans, housing, and a host of other government support to those convicted of a felony while labeling urban youth as super predators and instituting the 3 strikes laws. As this new criminalization began to set its foundation, it attacked the community on 4 fronts, and that was in the areas of policing, the pretrial court system, prisons, and parole and population. Under the policing situation, I read an article by a black police officer who said that 15% of police officers will do the right thing no matter what. 15% of police officers will do the wrong thing, always, no matter what. The other 70%, they fall somewhere in between, depending upon the day, the situation, whatever the case may be. We saw that with the George Floyd situation. None of those officers were in the 15% that would do the right thing no matter what. We did see one officer who was in that 15% of doing the wrong thing no matter what, and the other 3 were part of that 70%. Under the pretrial court system, we find things such as the cash bail system. That has had a dramatic impact on African Americans. As a matter of fact, if you go back and you think about Sandra Bland, the reason why she was in prison is because she didn't have the $500 that it took for her $5,000 bail, where you have to put up 10%. The result was she had to spend the night in jail. And while they call her death a suicide, a lot of us have questions about that. As you heard in the video, we make up about 4% of the prison population, but we're about 25%. We make up 4% of the U.S. population, the world population, forgive me, but we make up 25% of the prison population for the entire world. One of our biggest problems is in the parole and probation area. There's about 2.4 million Americans that are tied up somehow under parole or probation. That means that they have control over their lives. If we go back and we take a look at the timeline where there has been oppression and control, you take a look also at the fact that real crime is down right now, yet for some reason incarceration is up. And if you look at the fact that compared to other countries in the United States, for every 10,000 or 100,000 people, 707,000 are in prison. But of that 707,000, 2,700 of every 10,000, 100,000 are African Americans, and 4,300 are African American males. And this is what Michelle Alexander called the mass incarceration in the age of colorblindness, or what she called the new Jim Crow. And this is what we're living under right now. If you take a look at where we have prisons, where we have people incarcerated, 1.3 million in state prisons, 600,000 in local jails, 250,000 in federal prisons. And that's not even talking about youth that are incarcerated and immigrants that are being detained. When you look at all of that together, what impact does that have on African American communities? Mass imprisonment damages social networks of a family structure. God forbid that mothers are incarcerated, because that would definitely throw the family structure into a tizzy. Mass imprisonment distorts social norms and community values. Who is there to guide young people, set examples, give them direction when you take them out and you put those people into the prisons? Mass imprisonment also destroys social citizenship and economic power, because if they're out of the community, they can't vote. When it comes to the census, wherever they may be housed, that's where they're counted. So they're not even counted as part of our communities. And it does a major impact to the labor market, because you've taken that employment opportunity, or those potential employment opportunities, out of the community. I want you to take a look at another video here, and this is from a Central Park 5 exoneree who's speaking out on the Black trauma. That is now Dr. Yusef Salaam.
I want to tell young people especially that you are not crazy. I want you to know that, like right now in this very moment, we are all hurting, we are all in pain, we all see ourselves in everyone else. I want you to know that you were born on purpose and with a purpose. That means that God said you are going to be born on purpose. And therefore, you have to know that if you were born on purpose, you have a purpose. My name is Dr. Yusef Salaam. I'm one of the exonerated 5, and currently I am trying to fight for freedom, justice, and equality. One of the greatest things that I learned going through prison was that I was going to grow through something as opposed to just go through something. I found out that everything that happens to you happens for you. It's actually shaping you. You know, the worst part about it is that it's the old story that we've always seen, where young black men have been hanging from trees since the inception of us being over here in America, being brought over here in America, I should say, as chattel slaves. And on top of that, it reminds me of like stories of Anointed. You know, here a woman accused him of whistling, and they went into his home, pulled him from his bed, beat him to death, shot him in the head, and then tied a cotton gin around his neck. When they cry, we die. Young black men and also black women are always viewed in the worst way first, than in the most positive way, because of the way that we've been socialized. There is a benefit to be gotten to make us to be seen as the criminal. And it goes all the way back to the inception of what happened in this country that formed it. We were brought from Africa as chattel slaves. We were enslaved when we got here. We weren't slaves because the reality of who we are is in the statement that Dr. John Henry Clark said. If you begin a people's history with slavery, anything after that looks like progress. We keep doing a tango where it's like 3 steps forward, 18 steps back, right? And anything that looks like progress from that point, because we keep going backwards. Anything that looks like progress is not progress. Back in 1989, there were over 400 articles written about us
not over the course of time, but within the first few weeks of our case. People were casting judgments. People were seeing us as unfortunately guilty, having to prove ourselves innocent, as opposed to what the law says you're innocent until proven guilty. When you go through this trauma and you have things like cash bail and you can't make bail, and you know that you're innocent, but what they're putting up against you is, hey, listen, cop out. You'll be home tomorrow. The problem with that is that you come home as a second-class citizen. You come home not able to participate in the structures and the municipalities of things that allow us to be full citizens. Whether that means voting, being able to participate in housing projects, and all of those other things that go along with that. I have a family where my wife and I, we raised 10 children together. It's a blended family. And I tell you, the overwhelming fear of what their future is makes you want to stop and pause. My professor, when I was going to Hunter College, Professor Marimba Ani, she said to me, if we decided tomorrow that their system ceases to exist, tomorrow their system will cease to exist. If we decided tomorrow that we want true freedom, justice, and equality, we will have tomorrow true freedom, justice, and equality. And I'm not talking about by going to war, but I'm talking about us understanding what's at stake. Us knowing that we have to rise to the resilience of us as a people and demand better, demand more, not of them only, but also of ourselves. We can change things for ourselves. We can rise above the murkiness of where they want us to be in this box and become like Neo in the Matrix. We won't even have to dodge bullets. And I'm not saying, of course, literally we still have to, right? We still right now are in a space where we have to literally fend for our lives. My message to anyone in powerful spaces is that we will not bend to the pressure of oppression that you are placing upon us as a people. We are more powerful than that. We are better than that. And the most important thing that I want us as a people to know and understand beyond a shadow of a doubt is that our unity is more powerful than an atomic bomb has been said. Our ancestors were looking into the future, hoping that they were going to lead the path, or at least be able to pass something back, because this was a marathon. It still is a marathon, as Nipsey Hussle said, right? And I want to echo the words of Dr. Maya Angelou in this moment. She said, you should be angry, but you must not be bitter. She said, bitterness is like a cancer. It eats upon the host. It doesn't do anything to the object of its displeasure. Don't become the worst. Become the best. Yeah, we can outcry. We can do all of that stuff. And I think it's necessary, because we can't keep things balled up inside, because they may metastasize into something else. But become the best.
So where do we go from here? Well, as the rapper Killer Mike says, plot, plan, strategize, organize, and mobilize. So I want to discuss, how do you build your advocacy plan? In putting your plan together structurally, you want to use what they call the SMART acronym, SMART. That is, make it specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. Know that plans don't act by themselves. You must take action on them. And also know that your opposition will be well prepared and waiting to tear down your plans. So you need to develop a plan based on your knowledge of who those opponents are and your knowledge of who can help you. In developing your plan, make sure that you raise awareness, direct promotion of your cause, create change. Actions intend to be specific to specific outcomes. You want to have movement building as part of the plan, because you want to get a broad base of support behind you. And you need to determine what type of advocacy you need for your particular situation. I can't emphasize this enough. Control the narrative. Create it, direct it, control it on your own. Short story, long story made short is that I participated in the Million Man March. One of the good things about that is that it took away some of that narrative that we were the black man with no shirt, handcuffed behind our backs, getting helped into a squad car. The number of brothers who came out there were very positive. It was supportive. There were women that were gushing over the fact that brothers were holding doors open for them. It was a positive experience. And that's what you want, because you have to battle this narrative that we are criminals or that we are super predators. Design your plan with a power analysis up front. Find out who are your key players. Are they politicians? Is it the general public, your allies? You want to know who everybody is, and you want to know what power they hold in being able to address or to oppress your situation. Conduct a fact-finding mission. Find out how things operate. If we know how mass incarceration operates, then we know where we can start to dismantle it, where its weak points are that we can attack. Determine your strategy. Know what it is that you want to do, and then work your way backwards from there as to how you're going to get there. Right? Prioritize what it is that you're going to do. Sometimes it's always helpful that if you can get small victories, you gain a lot of confidence in people, and then that leads you to do bigger things. Keep in mind that when the Montgomery bus boycott was put in place, their original goals were very small. They just wanted respect on the buses. They wanted hiring of black drivers for black routes. And they wanted a fixed dividing line between the black and white sections on the bus. There was nothing in their original plan that talked about ending segregation. But as time went on, they saw that they can push for more. Determine what your tactical plans are going to be. Organize yourself. Identify who's going to be an ally with you. And if you find that there is someone already out there working on something, don't reinvent the wheel. Find out how you might be able to work with them. The idea is not that you get all the glory. The idea is that we address this situation and end it. Rehearse all of your planning just to test its effectiveness, and employ a same-page plan. You can have a multiple leadership model. This is where the civil rights kind of lost its way, even though they had some successes. But their whole idea was to coalesce around Martin. He was charismatic, and that seemed like a good idea. But in the old proverbial saying, when you kill the head, the body follows. And once they did that, there was no real succession plan to put in place on how we're going to move forward after Martin was killed. Mobilize yourself. Conduct one-on-one meetings with people. Attend any hearing or community meeting on this issue. Have rallies to inform and update people. Hold political candidate forums. Just be mindful of your tax-exempt status. You can't endorse candidates, but you can raise issues. Energize the community. Conduct voter registration and education awareness drives, because that's where your power is going to derive from. So you want to feed your power. Here's some of the dynamics that I want you to keep in mind. Ignore any naysayers. Biblically speaking, when Nehemiah was building the wall, Sanballat and other detractors began telling him it won't work, you can't build it, and eventually even trying to stop them from building the wall. Have a plan B prepared in case the initial plan doesn't work. In the county where I live, we fought for a community center for the community surrounding the church. The county executive, who happened to be a brother at the time, told us that he was not going to put that in the budget. So we backtracked and we found out that if we got enough county council people to override his veto, we can get what we were fighting for. And that's what we did. It earned a lot of respect from him along the way as well. Be polite when you're conducting your meetings, but be prepared to create some tension or pressure on politicians and adversaries if needed, because they'll love to give you the, gee, well, I'm sorry, I wish I can help you, but I can't. You have to know how to deal with that. Stay focused and be aware of bright, shiny objects. Now, in George Floyd's death, we have had a whole host of things have happened. Businesses started advertising that Black Lives Matter. People stepped down from corporate boards. Statues of Confederate soldiers and former slave owners were toppled. Musical groups dropped Antebellum and Dixie from their names. And football teams, hello Washington Redskins, finally dropped their derogatory name for Native Americans. NASCAR even banned Confederate flags. But keep in mind, so far we have not seen direct justice for George Floyd. We have not seen restructuring of policing. Keep yourself on the task. Just being professional, start your meetings on time, and always have an agenda. Don't meet just for the sake of meeting. And I can't say it enough, get training, get training, get training. I was trained in community grassroots advocacy by a group called the Industrial Areas Foundation, founded by Saul Alinsky. It's the same group that trained a young Barack Obama when he was a community organizer. And what I saw during his political campaign for president, many of the things that were in there, he took right out of their playbook. And that's why he has such a strong, effective grassroots organization that propelled him to the White House. Here's a couple of must-dos that you need to consider if you're putting together your advocacy plan. I won't go through all of them, but just to point out some of them, make sure that your police department has a ban on no-knock warrants, on chokeholds, and that they hold sanctity of life as a prime directive. Not that they're going in there to kill somebody, but that they're going in there because they have a job to do and they want to do it professionally. You want to make sure that you look at any exception clauses that protect law enforcement personnel from personal lawsuits by citizens who've had their civil rights violated. So keep in mind when you're looking at that they have what they call the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights. You want to examine that and make sure that there are no protections in there that say you cannot get justice for wrongdoing. Establish community review boards selected by the people. Don't wait for your police department or your city government to say we're going to put together a review board or community review board. Do it yourselves. And to that extent, develop your own problem police officer database. The federal government now is talking about encouraging cities and towns to have a database. But if you don't have control over what's the criteria for someone ending up on the problem police officer database, we might find that we'll have more situations like the one that we had in Cleveland, Ohio, where an officer Loman can get fired from one police department only to show up in Cleveland and jump out of a car and within 2 seconds shoot a Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old boy. You want to make sure that you control that situation. Okay? There's some other things there. Feel free to look those over. I will have this available for anyone who wants this. What I want to do is just talk about a couple of things. I belong to an organization called the Maryland Alliance for Justice Reform, and they have a model that they use. I called and asked if it's okay if I show that. They told me that not only is it okay for me to show this to you all, but to invite you all to sit in on one of their Zoom sessions if you want to, and we'll talk about that as we get to the end. They have it broken down into 3 categories: the front door, behind the walls, and the back door. So you can see the list of things that we are working on. This is legislation that we have brought to the state capitol. Some of it we've had success with. Some of it did not become law, but we keep going back. We keep tweaking it until we can get it right. Behind the walls, we're looking at things such as the Second Look Act, be able to get judges to revise sentences after people have been rehabilitated. In the state of Maryland, if you come in there and you are not a high school graduate, you can get credit for time off if you participate in education milestones, getting your GED and things of that sort. On the back door, we're looking at reentry roundtables. We're looking at those collateral consequences. How can we get expungement? In Maryland, we've restored voting rights for those who have paid their debt to society. And we work with employers for any incentives that we might be able to provide to get them to hire people to work. So you see the address, email address, backdoor@ma4jr.org. We have a meeting tonight at 7 o'clock. If you have nothing else to do, feel free to send them an email so that they will add you to the list. Tell them I sent you. And I want to talk about, just quickly, what does defund the police mean? Because there's a lot of controversy and a lot of misunderstanding about what that is. And basically, as it says in the first panel, it's reallocating law enforcement resources for more mental health and social services. If you go to that last panel, you see that someone who's occupying the White House thinks he can use the words defund the police to scare people into voting for him. Let's take a look at what it really means. Here's the city of Fullerton, California. This is their 2020-21 budget. $106 million. Of that, 47% of it, about $50 million, goes to the police department. You notice that community development only gets about 5%. Library, for God's sakes, only gets 4%. What we're talking about doing is just shifting that around. Whatever is on the police's table that can be taken off, we want to move that off, and we want to do so with whatever the budget is for that. So it's more of defunding the police. Think more in terms of divesting and investing, okay? Divest from the police budget and put it into some of the other budgets, such as substance abuse, instead of criminalizing it, mental health conditions, instead of showing up and shooting people, education, get them out of our schools. We don't need police officers roaming the halls. Job training, affordable housing, there's an idea. How about instead of building more prisons, build more affordable housing? The reason why I'm telling you this and showing you this is because when you look at this, this becomes a tool to disrupt the status quo, and it could be a game changer. If they're unwilling to meet any other demands that you have, then you can go to your nuclear option. Talk about defunding them. Talk about dismantling them. This way, you'll get the unions on board with you. You'll get politicians on board with you. It's not necessarily the first card that you want to pull, but it's what you want to have in your hand so that if you're not getting cooperation, you can get their attention. This goes to what our keynote speaker was saying this morning. Sometimes you got to show up and you have to be armed to the teeth before you get their attention. So I asked the question, where will it end? And I say, as I started out, the criminal justice system is not broken. It functions exactly as it was meant to. So the question is that we can sit here and do nothing and let things continue its path, or we can affect change to build a world that we think it should be. The decision basically is up to us. If we decided tomorrow that their system ceases to exist, tomorrow their system will cease to exist. If we decided tomorrow we want true freedom, justice, and equality, we will have tomorrow true freedom, justice, and equality. Are you willing to do that? Here's a reading list of some things if you're more interested in this subject. The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, Rethinking Incarceration by Dominique Gilliard, Thinking Theology About Mass Incarceration, put out by the National Council of Churches. Stamped from the beginning. This is a promising young author, Ibram X. Kendi. and Woke Church by Eric Mason. Some of the things that are on my reading list that I've yet to read, but I intend to, you can see some of the titles there. I'm happy to send this out to anyone who wants it. So if you want the reading list, if you want handouts, or if you just want to talk about what your next steps are, I've set up an email address for you, chuck.bethechurch@gmail. My LinkedIn address and my Twitter address are there. And if we have time left, I hope, I just want to say thank you. If you have questions, I'm open to hearing them. I think we probably may have gone right into the end, but thank you very much. I thank you for attending. And again, if there are any questions, I'll be here so that I can talk about it. And I see Maisha says, is the Maryland Alliance for Justice Reform working with other national networks? Also, are there churches which are involved in reentry programs? Yes, there are some churches that are involved in reentry programs. I did not include that slide because I kept trying to get this boiled down to the 45 minutes. But in my own church, we work with the prison system. We had one of the case examples that I wanted to share was we had a young man who started while he was in his outpatient outreach program. He attended Sunday school and worship sessions with us. We transported him from his halfway house to church and back. He also participated in a work release program with Darden Restaurants. He started out as a prep chef. And the reason why I mentioned Darden Restaurants is because I do support them, because they do support giving second chances to people. He started out as a prep chef. Once he was released, they promoted him, all right, to a line chef. Unfortunately, he had a situation where he failed to meet with his parole officer. He got picked up, brought back in, but he has been released again. He is now married. He has 2 children. He's doing well. So yes, there are churches that can work with them. As far as the Maryland Alliance for Justice Reform is concerned, I'm not sure if they're working with other national networks, as most of these are state laws. So one of the things that they are doing is they're cross-checking with other states to see what's going on in those states and see if it can be applied in the state of Maryland. And I would imagine that other states may be doing the same thing. But again, I invite you, if you want to, you can plug in tonight and just sit in on the session to get some idea of how you may be able to work with this. Are there any other questions? Oh, yes. Okay. Marjorie Kennard asked, can you see me now? Yes. Hi. Okay. I hope, I did this because I didn't want looking at me and looking at the room that I'm in to take away from your focus on the screen. So I hope that worked, and I hope that it was effective. But thank you, Marjorie. Are there any other questions?